Hi guys, my name is Stephanie and I am back today with another DIY. Today I'm going to be showing you how to dead end molding like this pretty trim you see here on my office bookcase, or the dead end that was cut for the chair rail in our family room. Today I'm going to show you how I'm going to dead end the trim molding that I am putting in the built-ins that I just built for one of the closets in our house. So for this project, I'm using a half round trim so that it looks like a bull nose edge on that countertop you see there. And I want to get a pretty end on it. So a dead end on molding is sometimes called also a pretty end on molding or a return end on molding. So it's how you return it back to the wall so that it looks nice. So I'm going to show you a quick walkthrough of the steps. And I want you to know that this walkthrough is going to apply to any of the molding that sits flush against the wall. So that chair rail, the end cap, the half round that I'm using, any type of molding, baseboards even, it's going to be cut the same way. So the first thing I did here was to mark where I wanted to make the cut for that dead end on my trim. And in this case, there's no hard set rule for where I would end this molding, but I thought it would look nice coming out at least about an inch past the end of that countertop. I just thought it would look prettier, but that's all personal preference. If you have to end your trim at a windowsill or a door frame, obviously you've got a hard set rule there. You need it to be pretty close, like I showed in the chair rail earlier in the video. I used my miter saw to make this cut. You could use a miter box, but cutting tiny bits of trim molding with a miter box is a lot harder than it sounds. So if you do have access to a miter saw, that's going to be the easiest way to do this. I'm starting with the smallest part of the dead end cut for this trim molding. So you want the back of your trim against the fence on your miter saw, and you're going to cut it at a 45 so that the front of the trim is actually the longest part of that 45. And the back side of that trim is the shortest part of that 45. Then you want to make a cut basically along that line along the back of the molding. So you're just cutting off that 45 to use to make the pretty end on your trim molding. So this is done with your saw blade cut set to 0. So there's no angle on it anymore. You're just doing a straight cut down that trim. So that's the little piece for our dead end molding cut. I set that aside and then I made my regular cut for the trim. Whenever you're working with your miter saw, I probably don't have to say this, but just make sure you're not working with a tiny bit of trim and you've got your hands too close to the blade. Work with a nice long piece of molding so that you don't have to worry about safety when you're making these tiny cuts. You want that tiny cut to be the off cut. Okay, so now I'm about to make the cut for the big piece of that dead end trim molding, and this one is done basically the same way. You want the front of that trim to be the longest part of the trim and the back side to be cut at a 45 angling back into the back side of the trim. Then the tiny piece of trim and the longer piece of trim should make a beautiful little return end back into the wall or the furniture that you're putting it on. Let's go inside and have a look and see how this turned out. I started by attaching the longer piece of that trim to my built-ins in the closet. For this part, I just used my 18 gauge brad nailer. I use it for almost everything. I will not be using it for the tiny piece, so stay tuned to see how I attach this. Okay, so whenever I'm working with this small piece on a dead end or returned end molding cut, I only ever use glue with it. I've tried using brad nails in the past. It always splits those pieces right in half, and you don't want that. You'll have to go make your cuts again. It's just a pain. The easiest, best way to do this, whether it's with chair rail, end caps, or this 1/2 inch round, it is to make sure you use a good quality wood glue and then tape it in place with painter's tape to hold it securely exactly where you want it while the glue dries. Okay, I want to point out here that I was about to glue that piece in place when I realized it was just a hair too big to get a really pretty dead end on that molding. So I decided to go back and cut another piece for it. Don't be afraid to go cut the piece again. It is way better to have a perfect look than it is to spend the rest of your life staring at that dead end cut that wasn't done perfectly the first time. So I used wood glue on both sides of that little piece of trim molding. I got it lined up perfectly, and then I held it in place with painter's tape while it dried. And stick around, I'm going to show you how I finish trim molding like this to get a really professional looking, beautiful look. Okay, it's a few hours later. That wood glue has completely dried and set, and I am ready to start finishing this bit of trim molding. I start by filling all of the nail holes with spackling or wood filler. I like spackling better because it sands a little bit easier, but use either one that you have. As you can see, I like to slightly overfill all of the nail holes. It just makes it easier to get a flush finish with that spackling. Then again, I let that dry according to the directions on the container before I came back to sand it. I like to use this little micro zip by Gator for sanding trim molding. It has a nice flat surface, but it's also tiny, so it can get into all the detail on trim. Just makes it super easy. And that flat part makes it great for sanding those nail holes flush. After sanding away all of that extra spackling, I clean off the dust and I move on to caulking the seam between the trim and the built-ins or the furniture or the wall, wherever you're attaching that trim. I use my finger to push that trim into the gaps between the two pieces of wood, and then I wipe away the excess caulk with a damp rag, and I let that dry. This caulk needs to dry for about 20-30 minutes before I paint, so I let that dry and come back for my first coat of paint. So since I use brad nails in my trim, sometimes you can still see the nail holes after I've even used that spackling. So I have a trick where I put on that first coat of paint and I let that completely dry, and then I sand again. That way the paint works as sort of a second filler on the nail holes, and I can get a perfectly flush looking beautiful piece of trim that you can't see any nail holes on. And in case you're wondering, I'm using Magnolia Homes by Kills acrylic-based paint. It's the cabinet paint for this project. It's acrylic-based, so it dries and cures really hard, so it makes it really easy to sand. So after clearing all of the dust off from sanding, I then go back with 2 more coats on the trim of that paint. So make sure you follow the dry times in between coats so that your paint cures properly and quickly. 2 more coats, and then I am ready to show you how great the dead-end trim cut on this molding looks. Okay, that's it for how to cut dead-end molding. Here is a look at that dead-end cut on our 1/2-inch round from this project, the end cap that is on the bookcase in our office, and the chair rail from our family room. You guys, you can find more videos about cutting trim and designing beautiful trim for all of your built-ins on my channel. I'll put a link in the description below. And right here up above, check out some of my other projects if you're interested in designing and building your own built-ins or trim molding projects. All right, thanks guys, and good luck with your project.